In 2002, Japan was shaken by a horrifying discovery at a Tokyo train station. One of the train cars caught fire due to an electrical malfunction, and passengers were forced to hastily evacuate the train. Several hours later, when authorities began sorting through the luggage left in panic by the passengers, they found something dreadful. A teenage girl with amputated limbs was wrapped in plastic with small breathing holes. Her vocal cords had been removed to prevent her from screaming. Astonishingly, there were no signs of violence on her. Her health was not at risk. Her body had been mutilated but was in good condition. The girl was wrapped in the same plastic used for packaging toys with a girl inside. The number 72 was written on it with a marker. In the same bag, there was a notebook listing her allergies, a menstrual calendar, and other health-related information. The police tried to obtain information from her about those who had done this to her, but their attempts were futile. She couldn't speak or write. She had no other means of communication. 6 years later, a 20-year-old woman was finally able to share the events of her past. Her name was Ki Kumi Mita Tora. She had been considered missing since 1999, and her parents had believed her to be dead. Kumi explained that an unknown man had told her that her parents had sent him to pick her up, and she had gotten into his car. The man blindfolded her and sprayed something on her face, causing her to lose consciousness. She woke up in a brightly lit white room in a locked cage with 2 other girls. In the center of the room was an operating table. Behind it, a man in surgical attire with a saw in his hand was preparing to amputate one of the girl's legs lying in front of him. One of her legs had already been amputated, judging by the bandages. What was most horrifying for Kumi was that along the far wall, she saw other girls who had already undergone the same operation. Despite their lack of movement, they were breathing and alive. After witnessing this, she lost consciousness. She woke up on a bed to her horror. She was tied to it. Her attempts to scream were in vain, and she couldn't feel the fingers on one of her hands. Her left hand had been amputated at the wrist and neatly sewn up in the room. She wasn't alone. The other girls lying there had 1 to 3 limbs amputated. They were all voiceless. Some of them struggled to free themselves from their handcuffs and chains, while others simply looked up and cried. All remained in complete silence. Kumi said she lost track of time quite quickly because they drugged them daily. She was fed 3 times a day. The restraints on her upper body were removed, and she could feed herself with her remaining hand. At first, she would drop the food on the floor, then pick it up and eat it. She couldn't communicate with anyone and could only see other girls. She started losing her sanity. She didn't know the current time of day or anything about her captors or their intentions. Occasionally, one of the girls would disappear, only to return later with 1 fewer limb. Despite the fact that there should have been several weeks between amputations, time had become irrelevant. After losing her last remaining limb, her left leg, she was moved to a place called the exhibition hall. In her new surroundings, she still lay in bed. The hall had a round shape and clean air. Along the walls were platforms with beds for the girls. Next to each bed was a marking, and in the center was an operating table with instruments. Next to it was an empty cage at that moment. For the first time during her captivity, she came face to face with her captor. He was an elderly man with a gray beard. She saw compassion in his face. He looked like a typical grandfather, without a hint of malice in his eyes. He removed her restraints, and she attempted to bite him. Apparently, he was prepared for this. He pushed her back onto the bed and attached a metal plate to her back, connected by some mechanism to her head and hips. Kumi didn't know that her skull and spine had attachments connected to the plate, which had been her last means of movement. The man brought a shield about 1.5 meters long with attachments. He took her intestines in his hands and placed them on the shield, securing them to the plate. The shield with the attached girl was hung on the wall. The elderly man left the room. Turn off the lights in the hall. Kumi says that the first night was a true nightmare. Sound surrounded her from all sides. Eyelashes blinked, and it was more frightening than the loudest scream. She remained awake for several days before she managed to fall asleep. When she woke up, her face was illuminated, but there was no one else around. The other girls had makeup on their faces. They were arranged by age, from the youngest to the oldest. She realized that they had been collected for quite some time. They all looked like typical Japanese girls with long dark hair and fair skin. The man returned to the hall with a bottle containing some liquid. He approached each girl in turn and poured its contents into their mouths. After that, he made another round, giving them water. He checked their physical condition once more. On the fourth round, he simply admired his collection, fixed someone's hair, or nodded approvingly. Every year in Japan, several tens of thousands of people go missing, with 70 of them being underage girls.